co-owner of the bookstore, along with my wife, Lissa Muscatine, and we're delighted to have with us this evening journalist Jeanna Smialek, here to talk about her very timely and informative new book, Limitless. The Federal Reserve Takes on a New Age of Crisis. Now, we've all been hearing a lot about the Fed in recent years, whether helping to stave off total economic collapse during the 2008 financial meltdown, or countering the shocks of the COVID-19 pandemic, or most recently struggling to lower inflation. As Jeanna makes clear in her new book, these crises, along with the actions of some pivotal central bankers like the current Fed Chairman Jay Powell, have fundamentally changed the Fed's purpose and function in American society. The Fed has taken its emergency powers to new lengths, Jeanna writes, stretching its mission as lender of last resort and purchasing government-backed debt in massive sums. It's gone from insisting that social issues are not in its domain to flying pride flags and shaping conversations about racial, gender, and geographic inequity with research and expert advice. Fed officials often talk about staying in their lane, but that lane, Jeanna observes, has expanded into an avenue. Now, Jeanna is very well positioned to tell the story of the Fed's extended role and its vast influence. She's been covering the Fed and economic policy for more than a decade, first for Bloomberg News and for the past 4 years for the New York Times. Kirkus gave her book high praise, saying it's the best book on the Fed in our time and a model of financial writing. And Publishers Weekly called it a timely and insightful primer on one of America's most powerful and least understood institutions. And we have a great discussion partner for Jeanna this evening, another very experienced financial journalist, Neel Irwin, who used to write for the New York Times and the Washington Post, and now is chief economic correspondent at Axios. He's also the author of 2 books, The Alchemists, about the world's key central bankers who dealt with the global financial crisis a decade and a half ago, and How to Win in a Winner-Take-All World. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Jeanna Smialek and Neel Irwin.
Thanks so much, Brad. I keep looking around to see if any of the subjects of your book, Jay Powell, Lael Brainard, Janet Yellen are in the room. I think they all live not too far from here. I do not see any of them, so we can have a nice free conversation.
Yeah, they didn't grace us with
they didn't show up. Maybe later. Jeanna, it's a wonderful book. I'm going to start with the most basic question possible. Why should anyone give a flying flip about the Federal Reserve?
Oh, good question. I think actually the point of the book really is that everybody should care about the Federal Reserve. That, I think we spent a long time, and I think I spent a lot of my career sort of treating the Fed as the specialist interest, that it's something that sort of the super nerds really care about and really understand, and that everybody else can kind of treat it as such, that it's something that a small segment of society needs to know about. But the Fed has really expanded in power in such fundamental ways that it really shapes our day-to-day lives. It sort of matters for democracy, I think, in a way that wasn't previously true, and that means that as informed citizens, I think we all need to be paying attention to what it's doing.
So the global financial crisis happened 15 years ago. I wrote a book about it that came out 10 years ago. A lot's happened since then, and part of what you do in this book is kind of bring us up to the moment. Tell us about the pandemic, to just start there, and what was happening 3 years ago this month that really had lasting consequences for this institution.
Yeah, well, you and I weren't sleeping, so that was an important part of it. But no, I think it is so interesting, because I think when you wrote The Alchemists on the global financial crisis, and when we were doing sort of this look back period on the 2008 crisis, we thought that was a once in a lifetime event. We thought that the things the Fed did would never happen again. And instead, in March of 2020, we found out that 2008 was a prelude to what ended up being a much more expansive, much more sweeping rescue of really the entire financial system. Everybody sort of forgets. I think it sort of falls by the wayside because there was just so much happening during that period. You know, we were all adjusting to life at home. Many people had lost their jobs. Everybody's stocks were crashing. You know, everything just seemed so sort of bad and there was so much going on with the pandemic that I think people missed that there was basically a financial crisis in March of 2020. And the Fed came in with really all guns blazing and snuffed it out before it got so bad that it became part of the fabric of how we remember that period. They bought bonds in huge sums. They rolled out emergency facilities that saved markets that they had never saved before. And just really for 2 months, every day, they pretty much unveiled something that saved some corner of markets, that some of which many had never even heard of before. And it was really this expansive sort of just absolutely sweeping, all-encompassing rescue that I think, really worked, but also opened up a lot of questions about what kind of power the Fed holds.
So this group of people in a building down on Constitution Avenue, they're deciding hundreds of billions of dollars, trillions in total, to do different things. What are some of those things that really pushed boundaries that now raise questions about what they might do in the future and how these authorities might be used down the road?
I think maybe the most interesting one, so I'll start there, is the Municipal Liquidity Facility, the MLF, as the nerds call it. These aren't named to be fun to talk about, but the MLF was a really interesting one because, and I talk about this story at length in my book, but because about a year before everything started going sideways with COVID, we had Jay Powell, the Fed chair, was testifying up on Capitol Hill, and he got asked this question by Rashida Tlaib, who was at the time a freshman Democrat in the House, and she said, last crisis, you all bailed out the banks. You did all these rescue programs for the banks. Next time, what about Detroit? Could you save a municipality? Could you offer some sort of cheap lending option that can help states and cities to get through a tough patch? And he was basically like, TLDR, no. We absolutely cannot do that. We don't want to do that. State and local government lending is just so political that the Fed would never want to get into that. And I think what was really interesting is within a couple of weeks of the crisis starting in 2020, we saw them cross right over that line. Municipal liquidity had completely dried up. States and localities couldn't issue bonds because the market just wasn't functioning. Somebody needed to do something to get it to open back up. There's a lot of pressure coming from Congress to do something to get it to open back up, and the Fed did it. They opened a municipal liquidity facility, and they didn't actually end up lending to that many entities. They only lent to 2, Illinois and the MTA in New York. But the fact that they even offered it, huge deal compared to what was previously thought possible.
So you write in the introduction that this is not a diatribe. You're not a Ron Paul in the Fed. That's not where you're coming from. But you're also not somebody who would reflexively defend them by a long shot. Explain kind of where you're coming at this from and what your point of view is ultimately.
Yeah, I was trying to come at it like a journalist. I was trying to not have super strong opinions about where this should all end up. But I do think that, as a journalist, part of your role is to say, here's what society should be talking about. Here's where we haven't really paid enough attention. Here's where we maybe aren't shining enough of a light. And like I said, in 2020, there was just so much going on that I think that all of this was pretty well covered in the moment, but maybe we don't really remember what happened. And I think we certainly haven't really had a conversation about what happened, what kind of political pressures the Fed came under, what kind of precedent this all set out. And so I think that the sort of point of the book is hopefully that these things are worth talking about. This is a period that a lot happened during, a lot of precedents were laid out, and we should probably think about what those precedents mean.
So let's dive into one thing I like about your book. It's about economics, it's about economic policy, but it is driven by characters. And let's talk about a few of them. We'll start with the big guy. So Jay Powell, Jerome Powell, who is he? Where did he come from? For people who only heard of him a few years ago when he became Fed chair, tell us about his background and how he ended up in the position he's in.
Yeah, so Jerome Powell's a local. He is from this area. He grew up in Georgetown or Chevy Chase, and he was the child of a fairly large family in the area. They were Catholic. He went to Georgetown. He went to the same school that Brett Kavanaugh went to, actually. He went to private school here. He went to Georgetown afterward, or he went to Princeton. Then he went to Georgetown for law school. Lawyer, worked in sort of law for a little bit, but then kind of made the jump over to finance. Spent a lot of his career in finance, worked in private equity for a while, and kind of flit in between the private and public sector for much of his career. So we saw him working in Treasury, sort of in the domestic finance arms. We saw him working at the Fed as a governor before he became chair. And
tell real quickly the story of how he ended up becoming a Fed governor, because that really wasn't on anybody's radar
Yeah.
until it happened.
No, it wasn't. It wasn't actually, and this is one of the places where my book breaks a little bit of news because he was actually working at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So he was working at a think tank for no money.
He had made a lot of money in private equity.
He had made a lot of money. He's worth, I think, something in the realm of like $20 to $50 million. You know, it's hard to tell with any precision because of the way these government forms are reported. But so he had made a lot of money in the private sector, particularly in the private equity sphere. And he decides that he wants to come back to Washington. He wants to work in policy again. And so he decides to take a job at the Bipartisan Policy Center. So he's working at the BBC. He is really focused on one issue in particular, and that's the debt limit. Topical, obviously, given the current discussions. Debt limit. He's really worried about the debt limit. He's fairly conservative. He's a registered Republican, and he is pretty conservative. He's very worried about the size of the national debt, but he also is very worried about sort of the showdown we have every couple of years over the debt ceiling and breaching it. And we were headed for a debt ceiling debate. This is 2011. Yes, 2011. This is 2011. He's worried about the debt limit debate, and so he ends up basically wearing out the rugs on Capitol Hill, going up and doing presentations on the X date at the time, which is the date that you cross the actual sort of limit. You really can't borrow anymore and think the extraordinary measures don't work, and you're past the point of being able to solve the government's problems. And so he is giving these briefings, and the government is not actually producing this number at this time. And so they are using his number that he is producing in his briefings. And he's talking to all these senators on Capitol Hill, and he's just super effective. People are listening to him, Republicans are talking to him, and he sort of, ends up becoming this sort of weird emissary for the Obama administration on Capitol Hill, which is funny because he is a Republican and he would not be the most expected member to become an emissary for the Obama administration on Capitol Hill. And so the Obama administration needs to nominate a Fed governor. They've just had a couple scrapped because they couldn't pass the Senate. And they are looking around to find somebody who's kind of centrist and who would fit that bill. And they're like, why not Jay Powell? He's a Republican, so the Republicans will probably vote for him. And he just basically helped us out big time on getting this debt limit deal done. And so, they send around letters, emails to each other, basically saying this guy is not qualified from an economic perspective, but we think that he's pretty smart, and he really did, a lot to help us here. And I've got some of that detail in my book. And the end conclusion is that they ended up nominating Jay Powell to a governor role. They were a little worried he wasn't a PhD economist, but they were like, let's go for it. And he got confirmed, and, rest is history.
And so then he spends several years as a Fed governor. There's 7 of them under Janet Yellen. Donald Trump gets elected. How does he end up in the big office?
Yeah. And so, again, this is one of those instances where he's just kind of the sort of person who's been at the right place in the right time. But I think he's also the kind of person who opens himself up to opportunities, like joining the Bipartisan Policy Commission during exactly the kind of moment when this kind of thing would happen. But he's a governor. He's been extremely helpful as a governor. He kind of chaired every committee under Janet Yellen. The backstory here is that Fed governors absolutely detest chairing committees. They're like a ton of work. They're very thankless. They're not glamorous. Nobody gets any kudos externally for doing it. And Jay Powell did a lot of committee chairing. He did a lot of committee work while he was at the Fed.
He was a workhorse.
People liked him internally. People really liked him internally. He was very well liked. It would be a regular thing during this period that you would talk to somebody who had just left the Fed, and they would say, like, that guy will sit you down and let you give him a briefing and ask you 96 questions and take careful notes and then remember your name and your kid's birthday. He was that kind of person. So people really liked him internally. He was in the right place in the right time, and he was a Republican, and it was the Trump administration. And so they wanted to pick somebody who was already at the Fed, who they thought would be confirmable. They wanted to pick somebody who Secretary Stephen Mnuchin, the Trump Treasury Secretary, had some comfort with. And Jay Powell was just in that position at that time. He was the clear candidate.
So how I'm guessing a lot of people in this room remember Trump tweeting insults and attacking Jay Powell for raising interest rates too much in 2018, 2019. How did he deal with that? How did he handle the kind of intensity of the pressure that came from the White House during that time?
Yeah, so it was interesting. It started out that Trump liked Jay Powell. He was kind of recommended to him by people in his staff, and he obviously got the job. But within like a year, we saw that Chair Powell just kind of pressed forward with the Fed's campaign of raising interest rates. Trump absolutely freaked out at him on Twitter, on TV shows everywhere. And Chair Powell really just kind of ignored it. He didn't talk about it in public in any case that I can remember. He tried
Had to bother them behind the scenes.
Yeah, I mean, it clearly did bother them behind the scenes. Actually, in fact, I FOIA'd some emails. Freedom of Information Act requested some emails after what I think was probably, I'm curious if you agree with this, but I think probably the single worst attack that Trump launched at Jay Powell was during Jay Powell's most important speech of the year at Jackson Hole, which is the Fed's big conference. Trump tweeted, "Who's the bigger enemy, Jay Powell or Xi Jinping?" Yeah, which is obviously it was not. And it was like while Powell was speaking, he was on stage when this happened. And so it was pretty it was a crazy moment. Nobody paid any attention to anything that happened after that at the conference. It was kind of sad for the next panel.
I think you're about to tell the story that his communications advisor, what did she email to a
Yeah,
colleague?
And so his vice chair, Rich Clarida, got an email from the communications advisor, Michelle Smith. She sent an email to everybody saying, "Hey, FYI, this just happened." And the vice chair just emailed back 2 words, UGH, 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 ugh. And so I think we did get some sense that they weren't completely thrilled with how things were going down, but they really worked hard to not let that seep out too much in the moment. It was obvious that they were unhappy, but they really did think that if they showed sort of any resistance or I think any, sense of bowing, it would be really bad for Fed independence. And there's this real belief that you need to be independent from the White House in order to set good policy as the Federal Reserve.
So we're going through the characters. Lael Brainard, she's in the news lately. She's now Joe Biden's top White House economic advisor. Who's Lael Brainard?
Yeah, Lael Brainard is a super nerd, I think is like the first and most important thing maybe to know about Lael Brainard. So she is a PhD economist, unlike Chair Powell. She was
vice chair at the Fed until very recently.
Vice chair at the Fed until very recently, which is why she's so relevant to this book. She was a sort of superstar professor at MIT. And she decided to come down to Washington and work in the White House. And she ended up becoming President Clinton's Sherpa, so a negotiator in international issues. She spent quite a bit of time at the Treasury, and she ended up at the Fed, first as governor, by the end of the book as vice chair. But she was really at the Fed for quite a while before the action in this book kicked off. And she had kind of, by the time that 2020 rolled around, taken on this very interesting role at the Fed. She was the lone Democrat during the Trump administration, and she kind of took it upon herself to make herself like the sort of person who was going to stand in the way of regulatory rollbacks. And so she was really interesting because she was just constantly at odds with her Republican counterparts at the Fed. We think of the Fed as this sort of nonpartisan institution, but when it comes to things like financial regulation, partisan identities really matter there. And she was just ideologically quite different from the rest of the Fed. And I think that's actually one of the reasons that she's an interesting character study, because it shows you how partisanship exists within an institution that is, in its policy setting, pretty nonpartisan.
And she dissented how many times from regulatory decisions in that era?
Oh, I can't
dozens.
Even remember.
It was
dozens.
Which
Yeah,
normally
it was
doesn't happen. Normally they're usually unanimous on these things.
Yeah, it was very weird. It was like a very unusual practice because not only is it unusual, but it's kind of frowned upon. Within the Fed, there's this real idea that you should be collegial, you should work out your differences through negotiation. Like that is the way things are done. And I think not only was she dissenting, but she was really laying out a roadmap of how somebody could go back and undo everything that was getting done. So you would get, I was covering FinReg during this period, and the way it would work is they would put out a financial regulation change. Randy Quarles, the vice chair for supervision, would be the person releasing it, and she would put out a statement alongside her dissent, and the statement alongside the dissent would be like why you would be unhappy about the change that just happened and how you might reverse it in the future. So it was quite a contentious moment.
All right, so tell us about Randal Quarles, name probably most people don't know, but he was a very powerful bank regulator for several years there.
Yeah, and also I think one of the spiciest speech givers in central banking. I think we can all agree.
That standard is pretty low, though, is the thing.
And it's not a high standard, but you take what you can get in the Fed press corps. I feel like Randy Quarles is Utah. He's from Salt Lake City. Very proud of it. He's a Mormon, and he is interestingly the great nephew by marriage of Marriner Eccles, who was one of the most important figures in Fed history. And he's very proud of this. He calls him Uncle Marriner. So it's a fun quirk of him. He's a very colorful speaker. He's a very interesting person. He flies planes in his free time, and he likes to give speeches comparing monetary policy to like aviation. The problem with that is that most of us don't fly planes. So for everyone who doesn't fly planes,
Also, planes crash once in a while.
yeah, right. There are multiple problems with this style of speech giving, but in an actual the real biographical sense, he went to Columbia. He's a lawyer. He spent some time in New York. He actually spent most of his time living in New York and working in big law, commuting to Salt Lake City on the weekends because that's how much he likes the West and that's how much he hates Manhattan. He took one weekend trip to the Hamptons, got stuck in traffic the entire way out, and was like, never again. I am a Salt Lake City guy. And so he spent most of his life commuting between some city on the East Coast and Salt Lake City, and he has worked much like Chair Powell, worked in and out of government a lot, often with Chair Powell. Actually, they're friends. They've known each other for a long time. He worked at Treasury. He has worked in FinReg for a long time. He's worked at banks. He's sort of done the similar rounds, private equity. But he ends up at the Fed in the Trump administration to be vice chair for supervision. And people were really apprehensive about his appointment. He was the first ever vice chair for supervision. The role was new. It was created by Dodd-Frank. It was supposed to be sort of the person who would coordinate all big bank regulation. And we hadn't actually had one. We had Daniel Tarullo under the Obama administration, but he had never actually been confirmed to the post. And so this is a very powerful job. He's the first guy in it. We all kind of knew he had some libertarian leanings, and there was this expectation that he might go ahead and try and roll back regulation pretty aggressively. We definitely saw him rolling back regulation, but it was interesting to watch it as a journalist because the banks were just constantly angry with this guy, and real angry. I think there's always the sort of performative, I'm angry with my regulator kind of angry. And then when you're a reporter, you do all of your rounds and you try and figure out if that's real or if they're just trying to say oh, regulation's so tough because they want regulation to.
They might be working the refs.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think they were working the rest in this case. I think they were actually angry with Randal Quarles, which was interesting. He was a very interesting person to cover, and it made him really interesting when 2020 hit because he was sort of the person who was sitting at that nexus between Fed and all of the institutions that it regulates. And so he was fascinating to watch during that period.
So let's talk about Uncle Marriner. You spend the first few chapters of the book really diving into some history, which I think is a great choice and really creates an arc and helps us understand where the more recent stuff fits in. Who is Marriner Eccles? Why is he an important historical figure and why did you spend so much space in him on the book?
Yeah, well, I feel like Marriner. I read a lot of Fed books in order to write this Fed book. I read all the Fed books, so you don't have to, and you should not read all the Fed books. I would highly recommend.
Except mine.
You should read The Alchemist because it is written very well. It is a great Fed book. But I will say, not a lot of the Fed books give Marriner much time. I think he's maybe the most underappreciated of the former Fed officials. We spent a lot of time talking about some of the other titans of Fed history, like Volcker. And I think we spend less time on Marriner Eccles, but he was a fascinating human. And he also was really important to the Fed's sort of historical arc. And he's really important to sort of the power accumulation that I wanted to talk about in the book. So I spend a lot of time on him. Marriner was the child of a family of immigrants. They had basically just been poor in Scotland. They had not been Mormon, but they converted to Mormonism to get over to America. And then they became pretty dedicated. They were pretty dedicated Latter-day Saints. And so they based themselves in Utah, Salt Lake City, sort of not OG settlers, but not far off. It's pretty developmental at this stage. And his dad just establishes this huge business empire, basically off the sort of the sweat of his brow. He works very hard, builds his business empire. And Marriner, when he's in his early 20s, takes it over and builds it up more, builds it into a banking empire. So he's in his 30s when the Great Depression hits. And the Depression is obviously terrible for many reasons, but it's particularly terrible for small banks and bank holding companies, which is what Marriner's got. And most of them crumble, most of them fail, but he manages to very theatrically stave off a run on the bank at his institution. And so he gains some amount of fame out of that, and Washington basically hauls him over to Capitol Hill to testify. And he's supposed to be talking about how he saved his bank. And instead, he lays out a several-point plan that actually ends up becoming the rescue plan from the Great Depression. And so he is really sort of instrumental in sort of like setting out what ends up becoming eventually the New Deal. And he ends up he gets taken into the government. He starts advising.
As I understand, one of the few kind of business leaders who really supported FDR and his program.
Yeah, absolutely. And he was really the only one FDR was listening to at the time as well, which is relevant. And so FDR is like, this guy is smart. We want him in government somewhere. Marriner's like, I'm piecing out and getting back to Utah. Like, I do not want to live here.
Randal Quarles.
Much like Randy Quarles. There's a lot of parallels here. Marriner has no intention. Marriner Eccles has no intention of staying here. And he is prevailed upon to think about the Fed job. And so he's like, the Fed's a new institution. It was founded in 1913. It didn't exactly just cover itself in glory with the whole Great Depression thing. Like the whole point was stabilizing the financial system. This is not going well. I will only take this job as Fed chair if you let me fundamentally reform the whole institution. And he's sure that obviously FDR is going to tell him no. And instead FDR is like, yeah, sure, do it. Like reform the Fed, have fun. And that is what happens. Marriner Eccles completely reforms the whole Fed. Prior to Marriner Eccles' reforms, the Fed was a really really dispersed institution. There were 12 regional banks. The regional banks were really powerful. There were still governors in Washington, but they were basically powerless. The Fed chair was just sort of an organizer. Like he was a figurehead. He wasn't really powerful in any way. And the Secretary of Treasury sat on the board of the Fed and really sort of ran the show. Marriner kind of changes all of that up. Secretary of Treasury and the Comptroller off the board. The Board of Governors is now 7 people, including the Fed chair, and the regional banks are completely demoted. They used to be called governors, now they're presidents, and we kind of don't care about them anymore. And so that's a huge oversimplification to any regional bank presidents watching this. We know you're very important. But no, seriously, they are important. They still vote on monetary policy.
So what's neat is there's this straight line from what Marriner Eccles was doing in the 30s, 40s, early 50s to the things that Jay Powell and Lael Brainard and Randy Quarles did in 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. So because he really sort of solidified the power structure and centered it in Washington. And that's really important when we get later in history. And I think the other thing he did in a later period that was really important to what we saw in 2019 and 2020 is in the 1950s, he was pretty instrumental in solidifying Fed independence from the White House, because that wasn't always a given. And in fact, it wasn't even existent in any way in the World War II period. So during World War II, the Fed is keeping interest rates artificially low to help the government fund itself. And then in 1951, we're through the war, and Eccles and his colleagues on the Fed really want to raise those interest rates. Eccles gets demoted from chair. Still not completely clear if that was about the rate thing. It might have been about financial regulation. But in any case, he's removed, and he just stays on as a governor. He refuses to leave, basically, won't cede the floor. And he helps to wrestle the Truman administration into agreeing to give the Fed some amount of independence, and then ultimately ends up being pretty significant independence. The Fed now sets policy completely separate from the White House. The White House has really no say, and that is sort of his legacy.
So to jump back to contemporary times, all right, they do all these things in 2020 during the early days of the pandemic that break a lot of precedents. They're coming under pressure from all different directions on areas that don't seem like traditional monetary policy, bank regulation at all. Let's talk about a few of those and how those pressures look and how they might unfold in the years to come. So climate change. What role does the Federal Reserve play in climate?
Yeah, so I think that this is so interesting. And in my book, I draw a pretty clear line here between the things that the Fed has been doing in recent years and the pressures it's now under. I think the Fed has become this really powerful entity in society that can do a lot. Huge research organization, huge, powerful shaper of how much interest costs, not just in general in society, but also for specific sectors, as we saw in 2020 in times of trouble. And so there's this really interesting sort of new set of ideas cropping up, like, central banks could be involved in shaping the climate transition and making sure that institutions that are helping to sort of put forward the climate tradition can borrow cheaply. This push is really underway mostly in Europe. You hear a lot about green QE, which is this idea that you don't buy oil and gas companies, you do buy the bonds of institutions that could be helpful to the climate transition. You don't hear about it as much here because the Fed can only do that with its emergency powers. It doesn't have the ability to buy sort of a la carte like that with its traditional.
That flared up in 2020, correct?
It absolutely
disputes.
did.
Should the Fed, they're buying corporate bonds, should they buy bonds of oil and gas companies, for example?
Absolutely, absolutely. And so it's just really hard for the Fed to stay as historically neutral as it has been in today's modern society, where everything basically comes back to financial markets. We are a very financialized society, and it's just kind of pushing the Fed, which has traditionally been sort of this referee for finance, into new corners that it hasn't previously explored. And the Fed is, really grappling with this in real time. These issues are pretty unresolved. I think it's really interesting. The Fed's currently in the process of rolling out scenarios for climate. Do not call them stress tests. They are not stress tests. But basically, these are going to put bank balance sheets through different scenarios and see how safe the banks would be in the event of a crisis. This is kind of the most vanilla version of what a Fed could do or a central bank could do around climate. Everyone basically agrees that the Fed should not just let the banks lend dilly-willy without thinking about the climate risk they might be incurring. But I think it's also probably a first step. I think we're probably going to see more pressure on the Fed to do more than this. And I think we don't actually know how they're going to respond to that yet.
So what is the Fed's role with racial equity and racial divides in the American economy?
Yeah, so I think one thing that I wanted to talk about at some length in the book, partially because I think it's just such an urgent question, and partially because I think it's often talked about in a kind of simplistic way, is what role the Fed's policies actually play in inequality. I think it's almost become like a meme in the media that people will say low rates, QE, worsen inequality. And I think that's just too simplistic of a statement. And I think it's often applied particularly in a racial sense, because anytime you talk about things that are bad for inequality, they're typically worse for racial inequality just because of the divides we already have as a baseline. And so I have a whole chapter in here kind of going through the arguments around this. But the upshot is you need to think about both wealth and income inequality when you think about these issues. Wealth being the amount of money you've accumulated over time, and income being just the amount you're earning every day. And Fed policies work in kind of different directions in those things. QE obviously pushes up asset prices, but at the same time, QE pushes down interest rates. And if it does lead to lower unemployment over time, which is kind of the goal, it could potentially mean that somebody has a job that they wouldn't otherwise have, and thus the ability to build wealth. And so it's really hard to say anything super definitive about the role the Fed is playing here. Doesn't mean we shouldn't be asking the questions, but I just think the conversation deserves a little more nuance than it typically gets.
So Jay Powell, this patrician Wall Street veteran Republican, actually became very focused on full employment and people getting jobs and some of these equity questions in 2018, 2019. Tell us about that.
Yeah, so this was such an interesting period to watch. So in 2018 and 2019, the Fed is coming off of this long period of very, very low inflation. Super low, too low, in fact. They wanted inflation to be higher, which sounds a little counterintuitive, right? Right? We did too good of a job. But it sounds a little counterintuitive, but when you don't have some inflation, sort of all the gears get messed up a little bit. You want a little bit so that people get wage gains, and so that the economy just runs a little bit more smoothly. And so the Fed is thinking about, do we need to set policy the way we've always done it, which is preemptively to choke off inflation before it really flares up? And the sort of flip side of that question is, have we been too hard on the labor market? Could we have let the labor market run a little hotter in the 2015, 2016, 2017 era? And maybe the answer is yes. And so the Fed decides to take this big review of its monetary policy. It decides to couple that with a big outreach push. And so and this is very much Chair Powell's baby. Rich Clarida leads it. He's the vice chair, but Chair Powell's idea. And they really go out into a bunch of communities, and they do these Fed Listens events where they sort of meet with organizations, and they really just sort of engage in a way that I don't think we've ever seen the Fed do historically. The regional banks typically do engage with communities, but you don't see the board just going out and talking to community groups. And it was interesting to watch in many ways. One of them was people were often surprised at what they were hearing, which kind of surprised me and made me appreciate why Fed Listens was actually pretty relevant for the Fed. Some of the economists would tell you afterwards, wow, I didn't know that was happening. And as a journalist, that's surprising to you, but it was really interesting to watch.
So how much of that push can we blame for the mistakes they made letting inflation get out of control the last couple of years?
Oh, it's like everyone's favorite question these days, right? So in 2020, the Fed introduces this whole new framework, and the framework is basically a little bit more ambitious on the employment side than it previously was. It says effectively, we can't figure out with any amount of precision where the rate of full employment lies, and so we're not going to try and do that anymore. You know, like that's basically just not, that's an oversimplification of what they did, but that is basically what they said. And the argument that you'll hear sometimes now is that the Fed was so concerned with employment and so hesitant to declare the labor market overheating or the economy overheating that it ended up being very slow to the draw when it came to the inflation burst that we saw in 2020 and 2021. That if they had not instituted this new policy approach, that they would have raised interest rates sooner. I think that requires a little bit of historical rewriting. I think actually a lot of the problem was probably that they misdiagnosed the inflation entirely. It wasn't the inflation that we got this time, and I talk about this in much more length in the book, obviously. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts here. But the inflation we got this time was very much supply shock driven. It didn't come from the labor market initially. I think in basically any analysis you'll find, and so I always find those arguments a little interesting.
So last question for me, then we'll go to you. If you want to ask a question, the microphone is right there. So you titled the book Limitless. You raise the specter that all of these limitless powers they've now deployed twice in the last 15 years in the wrong hands with the wrong mission could be anti-democratic and really problematic for the United States. Why? What are the risks and concerns here with this limitless power?
Yeah, so I think the thing that we saw happen at the end of 2020, the sequence that we watched that I recall in the book, is really the answer to this question. And that is at the end of 2020, it seemed pretty clear that Joe Biden had won the White House, but it was not at all clear that the Democrats were going to take the Senate. And so there was this moment where it seemed really possible that we weren't going to get any more state and local help. And I was hearing from a lot of my sources at the time, and I report in the book, that there was going to be a push to try and pressure the Fed to use the municipal liquidity facility to really sort of make sure that states and localities could get really good loans for really long terms at really low rates. And I don't think the Fed would have said yes to that. I don't think they would have capitulated to that kind of pressure, but it was the kind of political pressure that would have pushed the Fed almost into a fiscal policy role, almost into doing the kind of policy that Congress does. And it would have been totally plausible under the sort of laws that govern the Fed. They could have done it. They absolutely could have. And I think that that's really interesting. And I think it didn't happen. There was a big Republican backlash. Actually, the Republicans kind of tried to take away these powers temporarily. And we basically ended up in a place where the powers stayed because the Republicans realized and sort of came to agree that you don't actually want to take them away because then the Fed can't do anything in times of crisis. But I do think it also sort of raised the specter that's going to come back again in another crisis. The Fed can do almost sort of quasi-fiscal policy, and it can do it with a lot less democratic consensus. They don't need to do sort of like the messy negotiation that goes with passing actual legislation, but they can then kind of make the decisions that look very similar to what you would do through that messy negotiation process. And I think that's something worth reflecting on.
Thank you. There's a question for Jeanna. Go, sir.
Well, I think of several questions actually, but depending on the line, I'll only ask one. You mentioned their kind of emerging role, clear role in things like climate change and race relations and so forth. It's one thing for the Fed to recognize that their decisions, have an impact on these issues. Another for them to be actively involved. What my question is, though, is when do they discuss the influence of Fed decisions on climate change and so forth? At what point do they do this during the course of the governor's meetings and so forth, or is it more done back at the kind of the research level and through just how and how transparent is any discussion that goes on that sort of issue?
Yeah, that is a really interesting question. So the Fed is a really big research apparatus, obviously. 12 regional banks around the country, all of them have big research staffs. The board in Washington has a research staff. And so what we've really seen is that the Fed has started to sort of discuss the climate issue and discussed how it relates to monetary policy in a research forum. And so the San Francisco Fed held the first ever conference on climate. I believe it was in 2018, but check me on that. And that kind of kicked off what has been a pretty robust research agenda from them. And so we've seen them holding a lot of conferences. They typically release the papers. They're often live streamed, where they do talk about sort of both what climate change is going to mean for the economy, but also what sort of economic activity and things that are in the Fed's domain mean for climate change. And I think that's sort of the primary venue at this point. We don't really see it popping up too much in Fed minutes, which is how we sort of get an account of the meetings. We do get it. It has started to show up, interestingly, in the financial stability report that the Fed releases 2 times a year. That's a really new development. We didn't previously have that. And so they'll do a little climate risk section where they talk about risks to the financial system emanating from climate change.
It sounds like one distinction is that it's more the climate or race or whatever is more long-term thinking about what could come our way in the future rather than how should we act now in our decision making currently.
Yeah, I think that's definitely true.
Hello, thanks so much for the interesting talk tonight. You spoke about the characters of the Fed with such wonderful familiarity, but what we as members of the public see about how Chair Powell relates to the press is what we see in FOMC press conferences, and he can seem kind of standoffish and a bit tight-lipped. So what do we not see, and how do you build the kind of trust and rapport that you need with them to write a book like this?
Yeah, well, Neel and I have both been doing this for forever. So I've been covering these guys in one way or another for about 10 years now. And so a lot of it is just over the years, I've been to a lot of conferences with them. I, know all of their friends. Also, I'm a journalist, so I know really all of their friends, even the ones that they maybe would prefer that I didn't know. And so I think a lot of actually, Fed officials obviously are not as sort of in the everyday mix as like a lawmaker, for example, might be. They're not as accessible. And so I do spend a lot of my time just trying to talk to people who know them, trying to get a feel for what they're like in real life, trying to talk to former students or people who've worked with them before. And that's where a lot of the color comes from in the book. And I think the interesting challenge of being a Fed official is their every word moves markets. And so I think some of the standoffishness comes from that probably. There is a real concern, like you want to be friendly and plain spoken. And when Chair Powell came in, he certainly tried to do that. His first couple of speeches, he actually gave in a very plain spoken way. And markets reacted absolutely horribly to that. And so he quite pointedly started reading off of note cards when things were important and started reading it almost like I think of it as his robot voice. Like when he wants to communicate something very clearly, he'll like be talking to you, be answering his question, and then we'll all of a sudden say, "That's a very interesting question. Let me read from my notes." Yeah, Neel was moderating a very important conference one time where he had to deliver a very clear message, and he literally brought out a sheaf of papers and like held them up so the camera could see what he was doing. It was quite funny. But yeah, so I think that's a long answer to your question.
And I think for these guys, when one time you give a speech and say something a little bit wrong and the Dow drops 800 points, it has a way of searing in your memory.
Yeah, you learn some religion.
Thank you.
Thank you for a very interesting talk and book. When I saw your talk coming up, I read the book. I think it's a real contribution in kind of putting a human face on these complex issues. And I think for young civil servants, that's very helpful actually, to be able to kind of read this background. That said, I have a comment and a question. My comment is that at about the time of Marriner Eccles, kind of 70 years ago, Milton Friedman, a Nobel Prize winner at the University of Chicago, made what I think is a very persuasive case that manipulating interest rates and manipulating the money supply is the problem, not the solution. He used to tell a story about a man who had a lot of car accidents. And people were very sympathetic to begin with, but after a while, they decided that his wife decided that he really liked to have car accidents. I think it's probably true that there are constituencies for crises. I think the government thinks that it can manipulate the timing of the economy. There's kind of a folk wisdom that if you get interest rates low enough about 8 months before a presidential election, it takes about 6 months to work through the economy, and you end up, going to an election with a good economy. And I think it's also true that some of the big banking houses kind of like crises too, because they make a lot more money if they're good and lucky in a major crisis than they can in kind of business as usual. So I think that with that kind of background, my question is, having read the book, do you think there's a danger in over glamorizing these people? Kind of, the cowboy approach to, there's a terrible crisis. I won't say wonderful. There's a terrible crisis, and these guys kind of ride to the rescue. Where there's a real question about whether the Fed is doing the right thing in the first place. We've just seen a year when interest rates went from nothing to what they are now. That's very volatile. If Milton Friedman was right, this is the problem, not the solution. So there you are. I thought reading the book that it was extremely interesting, but I thought it probably does over glamorize these people somewhat.
Yeah, so I'll take on the glamorization question and leave the monetarist theory aside because it would be a long answer. But on the glamorization point, so I think one thing I tried to do, and I hope I achieved in the book, is paint these people as people and not as like heroes riding to the rescue, as you said. I think that they were really grappling with some real challenges, and I think the way they grappled with them actually elucidates a lot of the conversations that are happening in government right now. And I think that there's a real relevance there, and I think it's much easier to learn about those issues via people than it is to learn about them sort of through a dry academic paper. And there are plenty of dry academic papers talking about every issue that I talked about in this book. Like academics have covered it. But I think that it's important. I think the Fed is an increasingly important part of civic education, not just academic education. Like it shouldn't be just the PhD economists who understand the issues that are part of sort of the bread and butter everyday work of the Fed. And I think that realistically, if you want to communicate what's happening at that institution in a way that a wide audience finds accessible, you almost need to use characters. You need to tell it through personalities.
Sir.
Good evening. I'm a professor at Howard University School of Law, teaching environmental justice after a career in the Department of Justice, environmental law. But a few years ago, I remember there was a series that was put out by NPR radio, which got my attention about the Fed and diversity, or the lack of diversity, should I say. And then there was a period where there was some attention to this. I have not seen any real change. I think the number of people of color that you can find, at least that I've been able to see, are not there. And in this particular day and age, and the problems with disparate impacts, I'm wondering if, when you mentioned in your book, now I've got to get the book to read it, but do you know what is the Fed doing about diversity these days of any import?
Oh man, you will love chapter 13. Actually, I think this is an area where the Fed has been really focused, and it's really interesting. And I've actually written quite a bit on this topic. It's something that I've always been really interested in as a journalist. And there was a period where they had a pretty bad track record, where they were just not hiring even RAs.
You had some numbers on number of PhD economists in the system.
Yeah, so I did the RAs actually. PhDs, there are hardly any Black PhDs in the system for a while. It's gotten much better recently. But when it comes to the RAs and the research staff, it was just extremely slim when it came to people of color, Hispanic people, Black people, etc. And so the presence of minorities within the Fed's sort of economic ranks just wasn't very good. But this is something they've really sort of concertedly been working on in the last couple of years. They've begun to hire pretty aggressively with a sort of, or I guess it's not, it's the way to think about it is more they've begun to recruit much more intentionally when it comes to thinking about hiring people of color. And so what that means is they're showing up at spaces and places where they think that they're going to find diverse students. They're talking to people at Howard University. They actually have a thing where people from the board will come out and teach a class at Howard occasionally, which has been a really good recruitment tool for them. They've had several RAs from Howard in recent years, from what I understand. And so this has been a pretty concerted push. The idea there is RAs, research assistants, often go on to get PhDs, and then they often come back to the Fed. And so it's a long process to build a PhD, but they do seem to be working on the pipeline. And they've actually recently done some pretty important, I mean, this is not the Fed's hiring, this is the president's hiring, but they've recently appointed 2 Black members to the Board of Governors. And so I think there's also representation at the top. And I'll note that one of the people appointed to the Board of Governors, Dr. Lisa Cook, who was formerly out in Michigan, has been really instrumental to sort of diversifying the sort of PhD pipeline. I think she is a real champion of the AEA summer program, which often sort of moves people from their undergraduate programs and into some sort of predoctoral pathway.
Is there any kind of metric or reporting system with numbers breakdown? And not only for PhDs or the upper management of the Fed, but I'm talking about the lower ranks, the career people, the people who sweat it out.
Yeah, I don't know if they have it for the non-PhDs. After I did that story on lack of diversity, they actually did start releasing annually diversity numbers in their ranks. And so that was something that I had actually requested from all of the Fed banks individually, and they now do it themselves and put it out every year.
Is that a public document?
It is a public document. They put it on the website.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Who else has questions for Jeanna?
Given the chance to double dip, I'm going to do that. Well, the comments about Milton Friedman actually made me think of this question. We used to hear so much about the money supply back in the days with high inflation, and when the money supply was a big topic of interest, and the different sectors of the money supply and so forth. And that has died out. So there's a sort of philosophical change, I'm sure. I'm wondering if you can sort of quickly give the history of worrying about the money supply, reporting on the money supply.
What is M2 right now?
Yeah, what is M2?
I actually just talked with Merv King ad nauseum, so I probably could answer that question. But Merv King is formerly from the Bank of England and a big fan of monetarism, or at least follows it closely. I think that you do still hear some Fed officials talking about the money supply. Particularly, I think of the Federal Reserve Bank of St. Louis. They are still pretty focused on the money supply as an important input to how they're thinking about the policy process. But I think a big part of the reason why the Fed went away from talking about the money supply is it's complicated and it's difficult to predict. Whether money circulates in the economy as a function of many things, bank lending, appetite for cash, et cetera, things like that. And so it's just, those are tough measures to follow, whereas interest rates have a much more mappable effect on the economy. I think the place where you can see that most clearly, that transition, I think the thing that most elucidated what actually happened here for me, because there actually aren't a lot of great histories of this that I have found at any rate, but Paul Volcker in his biography goes into this at some length, and then he actually did an oral history with the Fed probably a decade ago now, where he talks about this at length. And it's really interesting because he actually describes the monetarist period, which you alluded to, sort of the period when he presided over the Fed, when they really did focus on those monetary aggregates, as sort of a practical shift that didn't actually fundamentally change what they were doing. They were still targeting interest rates at the end of the day, but it was easier to communicate it as we don't want the money supply to be expanding so quickly. And so that ease of communication is really why they shifted. If you talk to some cynics, they'll say that actually it obscured what they were doing, because if it had they pushed interest rates into double-digit levels, people would have absolutely rebelled. And so the switch helped them to avoid having to communicate that so painfully. But I think that the answer at the end of the day is we're all still kind of talking about the same thing with interest rates. The way we talk about the tool is different, but it has a lot of the same after effects on the economy.
We're out of time.
We've got time for at least one more question, mine. So, Jeanna, talk a bit about the challenge that a journalist who has a beat faces when you decide to write a story that's focused on that beat. I mean, were there things that you discovered while reporting for the book that, you thought, well, do I keep it in the book or do I put it in the New York Times? And then how did that conversation with your editors go?
Yeah, I published everything. that was how I solved that problem. I broke several stories over the course of the time that I was writing this book that came from my book reporting. But at the end of the day, I realized that they weren't going to be that additive to the book as individual scoops. And the fact that I put them out into the ether and got people to talk about them actually ended up making them more valuable as inclusions in the book. I think the goal with the book, in my mind, the goal with this book was less to sort of break a story or break news, and more to sort of chronicle a moment in history. And so I thought that if I published it, it was more likely that that moment was going to get fleshed out. So actually the diversity numbers, that was originally something I was FOIAing for the book. And it ended up being so newsy that I decided to publish it right away. And that was really useful because I had so many people get in touch with me after that ended up making it into the book in some format.
Did you have an understanding with your editors when you started this project about how this would work?
I think people do that on a case-by-case basis. I think my editors know me well enough to know that I would never be capable, I'm temperamentally incapable of sitting on a story, so we didn't have to have that conversation. But I imagine other reporters probably would have.
So I don't know if you found this when I did a journalistic book where I was the same subject I reported on. Reporters often aren't going to newsmakers or sources and saying, that thing that happened 2 years ago, walk me through what really happened. We're always, what's going to happen next? And so it can be really good to do that kind of reporting.
Yeah, and I will say, there are some things in the book that are totally new that you've never read before, but they would not have been news stories in the New York Times because nobody is interested in the fact that the Obama administration thought that it was bad that Jay Powell didn't have a PhD. That's kind of irrelevant in the moment, but it's pretty interesting as a piece of history.
And with that, we're out of time. Jeanna Smialek, Limitless is the book. Thank you so much.
Copies of the